The dust of old Chicago tasted like ghosts and rust. Kalen knew the flavor intimately, the way a sommelier knows his vintages. This was a pre-compact vintage, circa the early 21st century, full of iron oxide from shattered girders and the faint, bitter memory of burnt polymers. He sifted a handful of the red-brown powder, letting it run through the gaps in his patched synth leather gloves. For 20 years, since the arrival, the Ethelgard Compact had been diligently cleaning the world, scrubbing away the grime and chaos of humanity's adolescence. Their floating citadels of ivory and silver drifted serenely in the stratosphere, tethered to the ground by shimmering columns of light, and from them descended the curators, the stewards, and the engineers, all with their placid smiles and their unwavering belief in the great stewardship. They had brought peace. They had cured the plagues, silenced the guns, and fed the starving. They had gently, kindly, and irrevocably placed humanity in a beautifully crafted cage, and most of the world had thanked them for it. But they hadn't bothered to scrub the ruins of the cities that had fought back. These places, the ones that had raged against the dying of their violent, beautiful light, were left as monuments to mankind's transcended barbarism. They were museums of defiance, and to Kalen, they were home. He was a child of the Rust, born a year after the Welcome War, a conflict so brief and one-sided it was now taught in compact youth centers as a parable on the futility of aggression. His parents had been fighters in that war, vaporized by a benevolent pulse from an orbiting vessel before they could even launch their hopelessly primitive missiles. Kalen had only their stories, passed down by his grandfather, another ghost who now lived only in the echoes of his words. The stories were not of glory or honor, but of a feeling, the feeling of being in control of one's own chaotic destiny, of owning one's own magnificent mistakes. It was a feeling Kalen had never known. His scavenger crew, the Rust Dogs, moved through the skeletal remains of the Magnificent Mile with the practiced silence of predators. They weren't looking for food or medicine. The Compact provided those in abundance at the gleaming dispensaries on the edges of the preservation zone. To accept those gifts was to accept the leash. Kalen and his crew were looking for something far more valuable contraband. They sought the bones of the old world, the forgotten technology that hummed with a different kind of power, a power the Ethelgard couldn't understand because it was messy, inefficient, and gloriously human. They found their prize in the sub-basement of what had once been a broadcast tower, half submerged in stagnant, iridescent water. It was a server bank, an ancient thing of wires and silicon, miraculously shielded from the initial atmospheric EMP the Compact had used to neuter the planet. Anya, his second-in-command and the crew's tech whisperer, ran a reverent hand over its corroded surface. Her face, illuminated by the green glow of her diagnostic tool, was a mask of concentration. "The core memory is fried," she murmured, her voice a low hum in the oppressive silence of the concrete tomb. "But the transmission arrays, Kyle, the broadcast amplifiers are almost pristine. They're crude, but the raw power output, it's astronomical." Kalen felt a familiar spark ignite in his chest, the dangerous ember of hope. The Ethelgard's control was absolute because their network was absolute. Everything they owned, from the anti-grav plates that held their cities aloft to the microscopic nanites that repaired their bodies, was connected to a single, seamless lattice of psychic resonance. It was elegant, flawless, and as far beyond human understanding as the stars themselves. Humans could no more hack it than an ant could hack a human brain. But you didn't have to hack a brain to make it scream. "Can you make it work?" Kalen asked, his voice tight. Anya looked up, her eyes glinting. "I can make it loud," she said. From her observation deck in the Citadel Vespera, suspended 20,000 feet above the placid, blue surface of what was once called Lake Michigan, Curator Lyra watched the preservation zone with a detached, academic fondness. She was a scholar of primitive cultures, and humanity was her magnum opus. Her dissertation on their tribal warfare rituals, from the Roman phalanx to the trench charges of their First World War, was required reading for all junior curators in the Sol system. She found them endlessly fascinating, these creatures of such profound contradictions. They could compose symphonies that wept with a beauty that resonated on a near Ethelgard frequency, and in the next moment, they could slaughter each other over a patch of dirt or a differing opinion on the nature of an imaginary deity. Her life's work was to guide them past that violent, self-destructive phase, to sand down their rough edges and help them ascend to a state of placid contentment within the compact. The resistance, the little pockets of rust dogs and other such throwbacks, were not a threat to her or the stewardship. They were a final, fascinating symptom of the old human disease, a cultural fever that had to break before the patient could be truly healed. Her instruments, which monitored the emotional psychic output of the region, registered a faint but persistent spike of what the human lexicon called defiance. It was a chaotic, discordant frequency, but she logged it with the same dispassionate interest she would a newly discovered species of beetle. She was particularly interested in a specific cell operating out of the Chicago zone, led by an individual designated Kalen. He was a second-generation dissident, a product of the very environment she was preserving. It was a perfect case study. He was clinging to a broken past, a romanticized notion of a freedom that had, by all historical metrics, been nothing more than the freedom to suffer and die needlessly. She had tried to reach out, sending probes with offers of amnesty, education, and a place in the new world. All had been rejected, some violently. It was a pity. He had, according to her genetic and psychological profiling, the potential to be a remarkable artist or philosopher, if only he could be persuaded to let go of his ancestors' rage. The breakthrough, when it came, was a bloody accident. The Rust Dogs had captured a compact steward, a low-level administrator who had foolishly wandered too close to the zone's perimeter. They had brought him to their makeshift headquarters in the bowels of an old subway station, hoping to interrogate him, to extract some secret that would give them an edge. But the steward, whose name was Xylar, had nothing to give. His mind was a placid sea of contentment and loyalty to the compact. He didn't know military secrets because there were no secrets. The compact's superiority was a simple fact of existence. Frustration mounted. Elias, a hot-headed fighter whose family had been re-educated after the war, grew violent. He struck the steward, and the interrogation devolved into a beating. Kalen tried to stop it, but the dam of pent-up rage in the room had burst. As the steward lay broken and dying, his serene mind finally fractured, broadcasting waves of terror and agony emotions so alien to his kind that they were physically agonizing. It was then that Anya, who had been working on the salvaged broadcast amplifier nearby, screamed. The main power conduit she had jury-rigged to the ancient device overloaded, flashing with a blinding blue light. Every piece of Ethelgard technology in the station simultaneously died. The glowing light strips on the walls flickered out. Anya's diagnostic tool went dark. Even the microscopic medical nanites that every human carried in their bloodstream, a gift from the compact, ceased their gentle thrumming. The silence was absolute. In the darkness, panting and surrounded by the sudden, shocking stillness, they all realized what had happened. It wasn't the power surge that had done it. It was the steward. His pain, His raw, unfiltered terror, primitive emotions he wasn't supposed to possess had been picked up by the amplifier they were tuning. For a fraction of a second, the device had taken the psychic death scream of an Ethelgard and broadcast it, creating a feedback loop, a focused shriek of pure chaos that had locally and completely shattered the compact's resonant network. They hadn't found a secret code or a hidden weakness. They had discovered that the Ethelgard's greatest strength, their perfect, orderly psychic connection, was also their most profound vulnerability. It was a pristine crystal bell, and humanity, with its endless capacity for rage and sorrow, had just learned how to make it ring until it shattered. A new plan began to form, something far more audacious than scavenging runs and petty sabotage. The annual Festival of Ascension was in 2 weeks. It was the compact's grandest display of cultural pageantry, a celebration of Earth's peaceful integration. It was to be held in Unity Plaza, a magnificent new construction of white marble and floating gardens built over the ruins of what was once Jerusalem. At its center was the Harmonizer, the primary psychic resonant beacon for the entire hemisphere, ensuring a palpable aura of peace and contentment for all who attended. Curator Lyra herself would be officiating the ceremony. It was the perfect target, not to destroy it with a bomb that was the old, barbaric way. They would turn the Harmonizer into a weapon. They would hijack it. Kalen's plan was met with a mixture of terror and awe. They would use their modified amplifier not to broadcast an Ethelgard's pain, but their own. Anya began working feverishly, modifying the device, turning it from a simple amplifier into a psychic focusing lens. The power source would be their own minds, their own memories. They would record their stories, not with words, with voice, but with raw emotion. Elias would pour in the rage he felt for his stolen family. An old woman named Shira would contribute her bottomless grief for a world she could no longer recognize. Kalen would add his own cocktail of inherited defiance and a burning, desperate yearning for a freedom he'd only ever heard about in whispers. They would distill the very essence of what the Ethelgard considered humanity's greatest flaw and turn it into a psychic contagion. They would broadcast a virus made of pain, a weapon forged from the human heart. On the day of the festival, Unity Plaza was a sea of placid faces. Humans in simple white robes mingled with slender, graceful Ethelgard, all basking in the warm, gentle psychic hum of the Harmonizer from her dais. Curator Lyra surveyed the scene with a profound sense of satisfaction. This was the culmination of her work. An entire species, once on the brink of self-annihilation, now standing in serene harmony. Her scanners registered the emotional state of the crowd as a uniform, beautiful azure of contentment, a perfect chord. Her speech was about to begin when a flicker of dissonance registered on her console, a tiny, almost imperceptible sour note in the grand symphony. She dismissed it as a censor ghost. Kalen, dressed in the same white robes as the celebrants, knelt at the base of a fountain, 200 yards from the central Harmonizer. Anya was perched in a ruined bell tower overlooking the plaza, the broadcast amplifier disguised as a simple comms relay. "It's now or never, Kyle," her voice whispered in his ear through a shielded, pre-compact radio. "They're already trying to isolate the feedback." Kalen closed his eyes. He thought of his grandfather's stories, of the smell of gunpowder and the roar of jet engines. He thought of his parents, who had chosen to die on their feet rather than live on their knees. He placed his hand on the activation plate hidden beneath a loose paving stone. He was not a soldier. He was not a general. He was a ghost, a child of the rust, and he was about to remind the gods in the sky what it felt like to bleed. He pushed the plate. There was no explosion, No sound, no flash of light. There was only a silent, invisible wave of pure, concentrated human spirit. It slammed into the harmonizer, not as an attack but as a new set of instructions. The beacon, designed to broadcast peace, was suddenly screaming. It screamed with the fury of 1,000,000,000 silenced voices, the sorrow of 1,000,000 broken hearts, the defiant rage of a species that had been dismissed as a pet. For the first time in her long, placid life, Curator Lyra felt an emotion that was not in her carefully curated lexicon. For a moment, she was not an Ethelgard. She was inside the mind of Kaelin. She felt the ghost taste of rust and ash. She saw the flash of a plasma bolt that had erased a family. She heard the thunder of ancient, primitive machines taking to the sky in a final, glorious act of futility. She was drowning in a tsunami of grief, rage, pride, love, hatred, and an indomitable will to simply be. The azure glow of the plaza flickered, turning a violent, muddy crimson. The serene hum of the harmonizer became a dissonant shriek that clawed at the inside of her skull. The floating gardens began to list and fall from the sky. The Ethelgard around her, beings who had never known a moment of psychic discord, clutched their heads and collapsed, their minds shattering under the onslaught of an emotion they had tried so hard to erase from the universe. And as Lyra fell to her knees, her perfect world crumbling into raw, ugly, beautiful chaos, she looked out at the sea of terrified faces and finally understood the warning embedded in every bloody chapter of human history, a warning her people had dismissed with a patronizing smile. The fever hadn't broken. It had been incubating. And the true war, the war for the soul of the galaxy, had just begun. The psychic scream that erupted from the harmonizer was not a sound. It was a presence. It had a texture like ground glass and a color like a fresh bruise. For the humans in Unity Plaza, the placid contentment that had blanketed their minds for 2 decades was violently ripped away. It was like a deaf person suddenly hearing a symphony played through a distorted, overdriven amplifier. Emotions they had forgotten they possessed came roaring back to the surface, the sharp tang of anxiety, the hot flush of anger, the hollow ache of long-buried grief. They stumbled and fell, not from psychic attack, but from the sheer vertigo of feeling again. A man stared at his own hands, weeping, for no reason he could name. A woman laughed, a wild, unhinged sound that was both joyous and terrifying. The cage door had been blown off its hinges, and the inmates were blinking in the harsh, unfamiliar sunlight of their own souls. For the Ethelgard, it was infinitely worse. Their minds, elegant lattices of pure, resonant logic, were not built to process the chaotic frequencies of human emotion. The broadcast was a psychic solvent, dissolving the very structure of their consciousness. They did not scream. Their bodies simply ceased to function and crumpled like discarded robes, their eyes vacant. Others stood perfectly still, a single, crimson tear leaking from an eye as their internal reality collapsed into a singularity of secondhand pain. Curator Lyra, however, did not collapse. The wave of Kaelin's broadcast had struck her with the force of a physical blow, but her mind, uniquely conditioned by years of academic study into the very chaos that now assaulted her, did not shatter. It bent. It cracked. And through those cracks, the raw data of the human condition poured in. She felt Kaelin's ghost thirst for a freedom he'd never had. She tasted the bitter ashes of Elias's rage. She felt the crushing weight of Shira's loss, a sorrow so profound it had its own gravity. It was horrifying. It was disgusting. And it was the most vital, vibrant thing she had ever experienced. A survival instinct, a concept she had previously only understood in the abstract, ignited within her. Order. Her mind shrieked. A desperate attempt to build a dam against the flood. Categorize. Analyze. She forced herself to her feet, her slender frame trembling. Her world was a cacophony of psychic noise, but beneath it, she could still feel the faint, steady pulse of the compact's core network, a lifeline in the storm. She had to get to a relay, had to warn the High Council. This was not a riot. This was not a terrorist attack. This was an extinction-level event, a mimetic plague that targeted the Ethelgard soul. As she moved through the writhing, weeping crowds, she saw the human who had done this. Kalen. His file flashed in her memory, a collection of dry data points that now seemed laughably inadequate. He was just a man, his face pale with shock and exertion, being pulled away from the fountain by his accomplices. He was a primitive, a throwback, a case study. And he had just brought her entire civilization to its knees. Their eyes met across the chaotic plaza, and in that moment, the war became personal. She was no longer a curator studying a specimen. She was a survivor, and she was looking at the architect of her people's apocalypse. The journey back to the Chicago Preservation Zone was a descent into a waking nightmare. The world outside the plaza was convulsing. Kalen and the Rust Dogs raced through the pristine, ordered streets of the new city. But the order was a lie, a compact traffic control drone. Its logic circuits scrambled by a phantom wave of indecision, caused a multi-vehicle pileup of silent, gliding transports. Humans poured out of their sterile residential towers, their faces masks of confusion and dawning fury. Fights broke out over imagined slights. People screamed at the sky. They had unleashed the human spirit, and the human spirit, uncaged and untutored, was a feral, unpredictable beast. "What did we do?" "Kale," whispered Anya, her knuckles white as she gripped the controls of their stolen transport. "What did we actually do?" Kalen watched the chaos unfold outside, his heart a cold stone in his chest. "We gave them a choice," he said, the words feeling hollow even to him. But a choice between a peaceful cage and a painful, chaotic freedom was not a simple one, and he was seeing the brutal consequences firsthand. The emotion plague, as Anya had dubbed it, was propagating through the Ethelgard network. In Paris, an Ethelgard engineer responsible for maintaining the atmospheric stabilizers above the European sector was suddenly crippled by a wave of existential dread broadcast from the Jerusalem harmonizer. He felt a sudden, crushing sense of the futility of his work, of the inevitable heat death of the universe. For a full 3 minutes, he ceased his duties. The stabilizers flickered. In the skies above the old city, it began to rain for the first time in 20 years. A dirty, acidic drizzle that sizzled on the perfect white architecture. In a deep-sea aquaculture facility off the coast of Japan, a steward overseeing the nutritional programming for the Asian continent was inundated by a psychic echo of pure, primal hunger. Not the gentle need for sustenance, but the gnawing, desperate craving of a starving species. His logical mind, unable to process the paradox of feeling starvation while being perfectly nourished, entered a feedback loop. He tripled the protein quotas, then quadrupled them, creating a cascade failure that would lead to a continent-wide famine in a matter of weeks. The Citadel Vespera, curator Lyra's home, was in chaos. The ivory towers, once symbols of serene authority, were now psychic echo chambers. Alarms, silent pulses of distress, strobed through the corridors. Ethelgard, who had lived for centuries in perfect harmony, were experiencing their first taste of social friction. An archivist felt a sudden, sharp spike of professional jealousy toward a colleague, an emotion so alien he interpreted it as a psychic attack and defensively erased 3 centuries of historical records. 2 pilots in the main docking bay, responsible for coordinating supply shipments, were overcome by a wave of paranoia originating from the harmonizer. They saw each other as threats, saboteurs, and initiated a system lockdown, trapping hundreds of vessels in the bay and severing the Citadel's connection to the ground. The perfect machine was grinding to a halt, its gears gummed up with the sticky, irrational stuff of human feeling. By the time the Rust Dogs reached the edge of the Chicago zone, the landscape had changed. The compact's silent, shimmering perimeter fence was flickering and dead. The checkpoint, usually manned by a single placid steward, was a wreck. A fire burned in its hollowed-out shell, and the steward was gone. As they moved deeper into the ruins, they found their people. The other scavengers and dissidents had emerged from their hiding places. They were not celebrating. A wild, feverish energy gripped them. Old grudges were being settled with fists and scavenged blades. Factions were forming and dissolving in a matter of hours. The psychic sedative was gone, and the raw, unfiltered humanity that remained was proving to be just as oppressive as the compact's peace. They had shattered the cage, but they had also shattered the society within it, however flawed it had been. "This isn't freedom," Elias growled, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade as he watched 2 men fight brutally over a can of preserved food. "This is just another kind of prison." Kalen knew he was right. He had been so focused on the enemy in the sky that he had never truly considered the enemy within themselves. He had unleashed a power he did not understand and could not control. His war of liberation had become a plague, and he was patient zero. Meanwhile, Curator Lyra had made it to a sub-level emergency relay station deep beneath Unity Plaza. She was alone. The Ethelgard guards who had been posted there were inert, their minds scoured clean by the harmonizer's broadcast. She sealed the chamber and initiated a direct, shielded link to the Ethelgard High Council, a consortium of ancient minds who resided in a geosynchronous citadel high in Earth's orbit, hopefully insulated from the worst of the psychic fallout. The shimmering image of the council formed before her. Their collective mind was frayed, tinged with a discordant static she had never witnessed before. It was the psychic signature of alarm. "Curator Lyra." The central voice resonated, strained. "Report. Our network is compromised. We are experiencing systemic emotional corruption." Lyra stood tall, the chaos of the day settling into a cold, hard resolve. She was no longer a gentle scholar. The infection had given her a glimpse into the human soul, and that knowledge had forged her into something new, something her people desperately needed. "The corruption is a weapon," she stated, her voice devoid of its former academic warmth. "It originates from the human species. They have weaponized their own primitive emotional state and created a psychic contagion. They turned the Jerusalem harmonizer into a plague projector." A wave of disbelief and horror washed over her from the council. "Impossible," a voice countered. "Their technology is inert. Their minds are simplistic. Their simplicity is their strength," Lyra retorted, the memory of Kalen's defiance flashing in her mind. "Their chaos is a weapon that our order has no defense against. We have spent centuries trying to gently uplift them, to cure them of their volatility. We were wrong. You do not cure a plague. You cauterize it." A heavy silence filled the link. Cauterize was a word with dire, final implications. "What do you propose?" "Curator," the central voice asked. Lyra looked at her own reflection in the dark console before her. She saw the faint cracks in her own psychic composure, the shadow of the human emotions she now carried. That shadow was a weakness, but it was also a key. She understood the enemy now in a way the Council never could. We cannot fight this plague with logic. We cannot reason with it. We must sever the infected limbs. I propose a full psychic quarantine of the major continental landmasses. Isolate the harmonizer's broadcast range. Cut them off from the network entirely. The Council recoiled. The implications were staggering. Cutting them off meant shutting down all compact infrastructure in those zones, atmospheric processors, food synthesizers, medical nanite relays. For the humans, it would be a death sentence, a slow slide back into the barbarism from which the compact had saved them. "It will kill billions," a council member whispered. "Their own chaos will kill them," Lyra corrected, her voice as cold and sharp as obsidian. "We will simply be walling off the infection to save the host. And in the meantime, I will begin work on a countermeasure. We have tried to suppress their emotions. Now, we must learn to wield our own. If they have made a weapon of pain, then we must make a weapon of purpose. A psychic fire that will burn their chaos from our network and from their very minds." The council was silent for a long moment, the gravity of her proposal settling over them. Then, the central voice spoke, its tone now grim and absolute. "Your proposal is authorized. Curator Lyra, you have full command of all resources for Project Cauterize. Save our species, whatever the cost." The transmission ended, leaving Lyra alone in the silent, sterile bunker. She had set in motion a plan that would unleash untold suffering, but she felt no remorse. She felt nothing but a cold, clear sense of purpose, a feeling she had learned from the very humans she was now sworn to break. The war for Earth had ended. The war of extinction had just been declared. The silence fell like a shroud. One moment, the world was a cacophony of rediscovered rage and fear. The next, it was nothing. The background hum of compact technology that had been the constant, subliminal soundtrack to human life for 20 years simply vanished. In the Rust Dog's subway headquarters, the last of Anya's scavenged power flickered and died. The air recycler spun down with a mournful whine. The silence was heavier than the tons of rock and steel above them. It was a dead silence, the kind that comes after a vital organ has failed. Kalen and his crew stumbled into the streets of the Chicago Preservation Zone to find a world holding its breath. The sky, once a familiar canvas of silently gliding transports and the distant, shimmering glow of Citadel Vespera, was empty, utterly, terrifyingly empty. The Citadel itself was gone, not destroyed, but cloaked, its active camouflage rendering it invisible to the naked eye. The shimmering perimeter fence was dark. The ever-present hum of the atmospheric regulators was gone, and for the first time in his life, Kalen could feel the raw, unfiltered pressure of the planet's weather system beginning to reassert itself. A cold, damp wind, smelling of the lake and distant rain, snaked through the canyons of ruined steel. "They cut us off," Anya murmured, her voice tight with a new kind of fear. It wasn't a system failure. It was deliberate. They've put the entire continent in a box and thrown away the key. The realization dawned on them with the chilling finality of a diagnosis. Project Cauterize, as Curator Lyra had named it, was brutally simple in its execution. The Ethelgard had erected a psychic and technological quarantine around North America, Europe, and most of Asia, the primary zones of the emotion plague's spread. Every piece of compact technology within the quarantine zone was remotely deactivated. Food synthesizers ceased production. Water purifiers stopped pumping. And most insidiously, the medical nanites that saturated every human body, the tiny machines that repaired tissue, fought off disease, and ensured a lifespan free from the frailties of their ancestors, were rendered inert humanity after a 20-year vacation from the harsh realities of biology had been thrown back into the wilderness. The first week was a slow, dawning horror. A child scraped his knee, and for the first time in a generation, the wound became infected. An old woman's heart, long supported by the gentle work of nanites, finally gave out. The common cold, a historical curiosity, swept through communities with the ferocity of a plague, as immune systems coddled by 2 decades of technological perfection proved laughably inadequate. Famine was not a threat. It was a mathematical certainty. The world's population, which had boomed under the compact's care, was now completely reliant on natural agriculture, a skill set that had been almost entirely forgotten. The gleaming cities became tombs, their inhabitants arving in the shadow of non-functional food synthesizers. The burden of survival fell back upon the outcasts, the dissidents, the rust dogs. Kalen, who had dreamed of liberating his people, found himself the reluctant leader of a dying world. His crews, once scavengers of forbidden technology, now hunted for heirloom seeds and manuals on subsistence farming. They fought not against alien overlords, but against starvation, disease, and the rising tide of human despair. The freedom he had unleashed was the freedom to starve, the freedom to sicken, the freedom to die. The irony was a poison in his gut. High above, in the newly christened Citadel Bellicosa, Curator Lyra watched the slow-motion collapse of human civilization on her monitors. She had shed her academic title and now held the rank of High Strategos. Her serene observation decks had been converted into war rooms, the air thick with the silent, focused hum of Ethelgard minds bent to a single, unified purpose. She felt no satisfaction in the suffering she witnessed below. It was a necessary clinical procedure. A surgeon does not mourn the diseased limb she amputates. She had become the very thing she had once studied, a warlord. She was leading her people in a total war d'assault, not of armies and fleets, but of ideology and survival. The emotion plague had been contained, but the psychic wounds it had inflicted upon her species were deep. A generation of Ethelgard had been scarred by the exposure to raw human chaos. A new, unsettling strain of thought was spreading through their society, a fascination with the very emotions that had nearly destroyed them. They called themselves the Tainted, Ethelgard, who secretly sought out the lingering psychic echoes of human feeling, experiencing them like a dangerous, addictive narcotic. They were a threat to the purity and order that Lyra was fighting to restore. Her countermeasure, Project Symbol, was her answer. It was a weapon born of her own unwilling education in the human psyche. If the humans had weaponized chaos, she would weaponize order. Symbol was not a bomb or a beam. It was a psychic frequency, a resonant chord of pure, unadulterated Ethelgard purpose. It was designed to be broadcast into the human mind, not to control it, but to override it. It would erase the messy, chaotic tangle of human emotion and replace it with a single, unwavering impulse serenity. It was a weapon of absolute peace, a peace so profound it would scour away individuality, ambition, and the very will to resist. It was a psychic genocide that would leave billions alive, but no longer human. To build it, however, she needed a template. She needed to understand the human mind not as an academic subject, but as a system to be hacked and reprogrammed. She needed a key, a Rosetta Stone to translate the madness. She needed the mind of the man who had started it all. She needed Kalen. On the ground, Kalen was fighting a losing war. Winter was coming. A true, brutal Chicago winter that the compact's weather stabilizers had held at bay for 20 years. His people were huddled in the cold, dark ruins, their numbers dwindling daily from sickness and starvation. Hope was a currency more precious and rarer than food. It was during a desperate raid on a sealed compact medical archive, hoping to find pre-compact antibiotics, that Lyra's trap was sprung. The mission was a setup. The archive was empty of supplies, but full of hidden psychic resonators. As Kalen's team breached the final door, a silent pulse of focused energy washed over them. It wasn't an attack. It was a whisper. The resonators broadcast a targeted wave of pure, manufactured despair. It was not a human feeling, but an alien approximation of it, cold, sterile, and utterly overwhelming. His crew, already on the edge of breaking, collapsed. Elias, the hot-headed fighter, simply sat down and began to weep, his rage extinguished by a tsunami of absolute futility. Anya's brilliant mind, which had reverse-engineered alien technology, was suddenly convinced of its own utter inadequacy, and she curled into a ball, catatonic. Kalen fought back. He focused on the ghost taste of rust, on his grandfather's stories, on the burning ember of defiance that had been his birthright. He pushed against the wave of despair with the sheer, stubborn force of his own will, and for a moment he held it at bay. It was that act of defiance, that spark in the psychic darkness, that Lyra had been waiting for. A shimmering column of light descended from the invisible citadel above. It was not a transport beam. It was a capture field. Kalen felt a pressure build around him, a feeling of being seen, of being known, on a level that was terrifyingly intimate. His world dissolved into a blaze of silver light. He awoke in a place that was not a place. He was not in a cell or a chamber. He was floating in a sea of soft, ambient light, his body held in a state of perfect stasis. He was not restrained, but he could not move. He was not in pain, but he could feel the presence of another mind brushing against his own, a touch as cold and precise as a surgeon's scalpel. Curator Lyra Numberea. High Strategos. Lyra stood before him, not in person, but as a projection of pure thought. Her form was luminous, her features serene, but her mind radiated an intensity that was more intimidating than any physical weapon. You are the anomaly. Her thoughts echoed directly into his consciousness, bypassing the crude mechanics of sound and ears. A primitive mind capable of generating a psychic resonance powerful enough to destabilize our network. I need to understand how. Kalen's mind, which had been reeling from the capture, snapped into focus. He was a prisoner, but he was still a fighter. He threw up mental walls, memories of brick and steel, thoughts of rust and ruin, trying to shield himself. Lyra's mental probe bypassed them effortlessly. Your defenses are crude, like the rest of your species. You build walls. We flow like water. You think this is an interrogation. It is a dissection. Her presence pressed deeper, not with force, but with an unnerving curiosity. She began to sift through his memories, his emotions, not as a violation, but as an archivist examining a new specimen. She experienced his childhood in the ruins, the taste of scavenged food, the chill of the wind off the lake. She felt his inherited anger at the compact, his desperate yearning for a freedom he had only imagined. She felt the spark of his defiance, not as an abstract concept, but as a complex cascade of electrochemical and psychic energy. Fascinating, her thought voice murmured, a flicker of her old academic self shining through. Your defiance is not a logical construct. It is a biological imperative. an irrational refusal to accept the inevitable. It is a flaw in your design, a beautiful, dangerous flaw. Kalen felt a surge of rage, a purely human emotion that was like a beacon in this sterile, mental space. He focused all of it, all his hatred for her and what she represented, into a single psychic spike. Get out of my head. The spike, which would have been imperceptible to any other Ethelgard, struck Lyra with surprising force. Her mental projection flickered for a moment. He felt a flicker of something from her in return, not pain, but surprise, and something else, a ghost of an emotion she herself was not supposed to possess. Annoyance. You see her thoughts returned, sharper now, colder. That is the contagion. That is the weapon. Raw, undisciplined, chaotic. It is a fire that consumes everything, even yourselves. I will not allow it to consume my people. Her presence intensified, no longer just observing, but mapping, analyzing. I will use your mind as the key. I will identify the core frequencies of your species' chaos, your rage, your fear, your illogical hope. And then I will compose a symphony of order to silence it forever. Project Symbol will be your legacy. You sought to liberate your people. Instead, you have given me the means to perfect them. The galaxy will have peace. Kalen, a silent, perfect peace. And it will be built upon the ashes of your soul. As her mind pressed in away, beginning the slow, agonizing process of deconstructing his very identity, Kalen realized the true nature of the war. It wasn't about territory or resources. It was a battle for the definition of life itself. Was it the serene, orderly perfection of the Ethelgard, or the messy, beautiful, terrible chaos of humanity? He was on the front line, and the battlefield was his own mind. He had to fight, not just for his own survival, but for the right of his species to be flawed, to be irrational, to be human. He closed his psychic eyes and began to retreat, not behind walls of anger, but into the deepest, most chaotic corners of his own heart, hoping to find a madness that even she could not comprehend. The dissection of Kalen's mind was not a process of torture, but of translation. Lyra, with the cold precision of a master cryptographer, began to unravel the complex, chaotic language of his humanity. She moved past the surface emotions of anger and defiance, delving deeper into the core architecture of his psyche. She found the bedrock of his identity was not a single us coherent self, but a constellation of inherited memories and cultural echoes. She experienced the primal fear of the dark from his distant hominid ancestors. She felt the fierce, protective loyalty of a Roman legionary for his standard, a genetic memory passed down through 1,000 generations. She tasted the bitter, wind-swept sorrow of a Dust Bowl farmer watching his topsoil blow away. These were not his memories, but they were a part of him, a psychic sediment that shaped the contours of his soul. It was a revelation for Lyra. The Ethelgard mind was a clean, logical construct, built and maintained. The human mind was a haunted house, cluttered with the ghosts of its own past. This, she realized, was the source of their unpredictable power. Their chaos was not random, it was ancient. As she worked, a strange symbiosis began to form. Kalen, trapped in the luminous prison of her mind, realized he was not powerless. He could not fight her directly, but he could influence the direction of her inquiry. He stopped resisting with walls of anger and instead began to guide her, subtly, through the labyrinth of his own consciousness. He led her to the memory of his grandfather, a gnarled old man with eyes that had seen the world before the compact. He let her experience the warmth of the old man's hand, the rough texture of his voice as he told stories of a world filled with art, music, and catastrophic, beautiful mistakes. He showed her the human capacity for illogical love, for sacrifice without reward, for creation born from pain. He was no longer just defending his mind. He was making a case for it. He was forcing his jailer to look at the evidence, to see that the flaws she sought to erase were inextricably linked to the very things that gave humanity its meaning. A dangerous feedback loop began to form. Lyra analyzed the human capacity for empathy. She was forced to simulate it within her own consciousness. To understand Kaylin's grief, she had to construct a model of it. And that model, however sterile, began to resonate with the psychic scars left by the emotion plague. The tainted part of her, the corner of her mind that had been cracked open by the harmonizer's scream, began to respond. She found herself lingering on a memory of Kaylin as a child, finding a single and resilient weed growing through a crack in the concrete of a ruined city, and feeling a surge of irrational joy at its survival. The feeling was alien, inefficient, and profoundly distracting. She pushed it aside, labeling it anomalous data, but the echo remained. Her project, her weapon of perfect order, was being subtly corrupted by the very chaos it was meant to eliminate. On the dying earth below, Anya had become the reluctant heart of the human resistance. While Kaylin had been its soul, she was its brain. She had salvaged what she could from their ruined headquarters and established a new base deep within the labyrinthine service tunnels beneath the old city. She was a pragmatist, and she knew the war of emotion was over. The new war was one of survival. Her first priority was cracking the Compact's quarantine. She reasoned that while the Ethelgard had shut down their own technology, the underlying physical infrastructure of the global network, the fiber optic cables, the satellite relays, the quantum comms hubs must still exist. They had turned off the lights, but the wiring was still in the walls. Her crew, the ragged remnants of the Rust Dogs and other survivor factions, became her hands. They ventured into the silent, frozen data centers of the old world, braving collapsing structures and pockets of desperate, feral survivors to retrieve server racks and processing cores. It was a race against time. Without the Compact's atmospheric stabilizers, the planet's climate was violently reasserting itself. Superstorms ravaged coastlines, blizzards, the likes of which hadn't been seen in a century, buried the northern latitudes. The Earth was actively trying to kill them. Anya worked with a feverish intensity, her mind a whirlwind of code and circuitry. She was trying to build a key for a lock she couldn't see, to find a back door into a system that was, for all intents and purposes, magic. She had a breakthrough while examining a piece of Ethelgard medical technology, a diagnostic tool they had captured before the quarantine. She discovered that while the tool was inert, its core crystal, a perfectly grown lattice that processed psychic resonance, still held a faint charge. It was like a psychic fingerprint, a residual echo of the compact network. It was then she realized her mistake. She had been trying to hack their technology. She needed to hack their language. The Ethelgard network wasn't based on code. It was based on resonant frequencies, a form of telepathic communication. The key wasn't a password. It was a feeling, a specific, complex, and perfectly ordered emotion. Hope, she thought, was too chaotic. Defiance was too loud. It had to be something purer, something more fundamental to their nature. It had to be the psychic equivalent of a prime number, an idea so basic and universal that the network would have to recognize it. She began to experiment, using the salvaged broadcast amplifier not to scream, but to hum. She tried broadcasting pure mathematical concepts, the golden ratio, The value of pi? Nothing. The network remained a silent, monolithic wall. In the mental space of Citadel Bellicosa, Lyra's work on Project Symbol was nearing completion. She had mapped Kaylin's psyche, identified the core frequencies of human emotion, and constructed their antithesis, a resonant chord of absolute serenity. It was a masterpiece of psychic engineering, a wave of pure order that would wash over the planet, pacifying the human species forever, turning their chaotic minds into placid, tranquil gardens. But the cost of her creation was becoming apparent. The constant, deep-level exposure to Kaylin's mind had changed her. The anomalous data had begun to self-replicate. She found herself running simulations of human historical events, not for tactical data, but out of a gnawing sense of curiosity. She watched the fall of empires, the birth of religions, the creation of art that was beautiful precisely because it was born from suffering. She saw the paradox at the heart of the species. Their greatest moments of creation were almost always tied to their deepest moments of pain. Her own mind, once a bastion of pure logic, was now plagued by a concept she had only ever understood academically doubt. Was she a savior? Or was she an executioner? Was the peace she offered worth the price of a soul? The tainted faction within Ethelgard society was growing, emboldened by the systemic instability. They saw Lyra's Project Symbol not as a cure, but as the ultimate form of suppression, an admission that the High Council was afraid of what they might become. A schism was forming, a silent civil war brewing in the placid heart of the Ethelgard Empire. Lyra knew she had to act quickly. The weapon was ready. She initiated the final sequence, preparing to link Project Symbol to every dormant harmonizer beacon on the planet. She stood on the precipice of bringing silent, eternal peace to humanity and restoring order to her own people. She had only to give the command. As she prepared to do so, a new sensation intruded upon her concentration. It was a faint, almost imperceptible psychic pulse originating from the planet below. It was not the chaotic scream of the emotion plague. It was something else. A single, pure, resonant note. Anya had finally found it. The key. It wasn't an emotion or a number. It was a question. She had been studying the psychic fingerprint left in the medical tools crystal and realized it wasn't a statement of command, but a query. It was the network's most basic function, a diagnostic pulse, a simple system-wide check. Are you there? She configured the old broadcast amplifier, focusing all its power into projecting that single, simple, resonant query. She didn't know if it would work. It was a message in a bottle thrown into a silent, cosmic ocean. She activated the broadcast. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence remained. Then, a single light on her console flickered, and another, across the continent. Dormant systems began to stir. The network, designed to respond to its own diagnostic query, was answering. A water purifier in what was once Denver sputtered to life. A single street lamp in the ruins of Moscow flickered on. It wasn't a full restoration, but she had opened a crack in the wall. She had reminded the machine that it existed, and in doing so, she had sent a signal that reached all the way to the Citadel Bellicosa, a signal that was not an attack, not a plea, but a simple, undeniable statement of existence, a single weed growing through a crack in the concrete. Lyra felt the pulse, the query from the surface, and in the same instant, she felt Kaylin's mind react to it from within his psychic prison. He felt it not as a signal, but as a surge of an emotion she had meticulously mapped, but never truly understood until that moment. Hope. It was not the desperate, wishing hope of a prayer. It was the stubborn, irrational hope of an engineer who has just seen a single light flicker in the darkness. It was a problem solver's hope. And that hope, that flicker of light in the vast darkness of his despair, was the one frequency she had not accounted for. It did not counter her weapon of serenity. It bypassed it. Her perfect, orderly chord of peace was designed to calm a storm of rage and fear. It had no effect on the quiet, steady confidence of a mind that had just been told it was not alone. The system, her perfect weapon, had a flaw. In that moment of hesitation, as she processed this new, impossible variable, Kalen acted. He did not try to break free. He did not attack. He used the connection she had forged with his mind and did the one thing she would never expect. He surrendered. Not to her, sis, but to her. He dropped all his defenses and willingly, completely, opened the floodgates of his entire being. He gave her everything, every memory, every ghost, every contradiction, every beautiful, ugly, human feeling. He showed her the joy of his first friendship, the bitterness of his first betrayal, the quiet pride of building something with his own hands, the savage grief of losing his family. It was not an attack. It was a gift, a terrible, intimate, and undeniable gift. He was showing her what she was about to destroy. Lyra was inundated, her mind already destabilized by doubt and the echo of the tainted, overwhelmed not by chaos, but by context. For the first time, she did not just analyze humanity. She understood it. And in the face of that understanding, her cold, clinical purpose wavered, and she finally, truly, felt the crushing weight of what she was about to do. The gift of Kalen's full consciousness was a psychic nova. It exploded through Lyra's mind, not as a weapon, but as a universal solvent. The cold, crystalline structures of her logic, the perfect geometries of her plan began to dissolve in a warm, chaotic sea of human experience. She felt the fierce, irrational love of a mother for her child. She tasted the salt of tears shed not in pain, but in overwhelming joy. She heard the silent, internal music of a mathematician solving an elegant theorem. She felt the quiet satisfaction of a farmer watching his crops grow, a feeling so deeply rooted in the soil of existence that it shook the foundations of her sterile, sky-bound world. And with this flood of understanding came a new, terrifying emotion, one for which the Ethelgard lexicon had no word, but she recognized it from Kalen's own memory's empathy. She felt the collective terror of the billions below who were about to be scoured clean by her weapon of peace. She saw their faces, not as data points on a screen, but as individuals, each a unique, unrepeatable universe of thought and feeling. The surgeon's detachment she had cultivated for so long shattered, and for the first time, she saw the patient not as a diseased limb, but as a living, breathing being. The command to activate Project Symbol was poised at the forefront of her thoughts, a single acrostic note waiting to be sung, but she could not give the order. To do so now would not be a clinical procedure. It would be murder. It would be the ultimate act of vandalism, erasing a messy, vibrant, and utterly unique masterpiece because it did not conform to her people's narrow definition of beauty. In that moment of profound hesitation, the schism within Ethelgard society ripped open. The tainted, who had been watching Lyra's psychic state with growing alarm, sensed her wavering resolve. Led by a strategist named Vorian, who had become addicted to the echoes of human ambition, they saw their chance. They saw Lyra's empathy not as an awakening, but as a corruption, a final proof that the human contagion was too dangerous to be contained. They did not want to pacify humanity. They wanted to erase it. Using a hidden command frequency, Vorian and his faction bypassed Lyra's authority and activated Project Symbol themselves. But they made a critical, arrogant alteration. They did not broadcast the frequency of absolute serenity that Lyra had so carefully designed. They inverted it. They weaponized the Ethelgard concept of nothingness, a psychic frequency of pure negation designed to unravel the very fabric of consciousness. It was not a song of peace. It was a chord of absolute silence. The inverted wave of Project Symbol lashed out from the Citadel, a silent, invisible tsunami of anti-thought. Anya, in her command center deep beneath Chicago, saw it coming. Her consoles, which had just begun to light up with the faint green glow of the reawakening network, suddenly blared a violent crimson red. The psychic hum from her amplifier became a piercing, agonizing whine. The wave of negation was designed to erase minds, but Anya's crude, human-built technology acted as a chaotic buffer. It couldn't stop the wave, but it distorted it, shattering the pure frequency into a cascade of psychic shrapnel. On the surface, the effect was devastating. Humans caught in the open clutched their heads, not in pain, but in a sudden, terrifying emptiness. Memories frayed, names and faces blurred. The complex tapestry of a human life began to unravel, leaving behind a hollow, confused shell. It was a slow, creeping erasure, a cognitive plague that left the body intact but consumed the soul. Kaelin, still linked to Lyra, felt the inverted wave strike her mind. He witnessed her horror as the weapon she created was twisted into an instrument of annihilation. He saw her mind, already grappling with the birth of empathy, now being assaulted by the psychic poison of her own people. In that instant, their roles reversed. He was no longer the prisoner. He was the anchor. He pushed back against the wave of nothingness, not with defiance, but with the full, chaotic force of the humanity she now shared. He flooded their linked consciousness with memories of stubborn life, of creation, of every illogical act of love and sacrifice he had ever known or inherited. He was fighting to save the mind of his enemy, because he realized she was no longer his enemy. She was the only one who could stop this. Lyra, anchored by Kaelin's raw, vibrant humanity, fought back against the negation wave. She did not meet it with force, but with the one thing it could not comprehend: a paradox. She took the perfect, orderly chord of her original Project Symbol and the raw, chaotic scream of Kaelin's emotion plague and wove them together. She created a dissonant, impossible chord of serene chaos, of ordered madness. It was a frequency that should not exist, a blending of two absolute opposites. She broadcast this new hybrid signal through the Ethelgard network, aiming it directly at the Citadel Bellicosa. The effect on the Ethelgard was catastrophic. Their minds, unable to process the logical impossibility of the signal, were thrown into a state of total psychic dissonance. The tainted faction, led by Vorian, who were spearheading the attack, were hit the hardest. Their minds, caught between the desire for absolute order and the allure of chaotic emotion, were ripped apart. The Citadel Bellicosa, once a symbol of serene power, became a mausoleum, its inhabitants falling into a permanent, silent catatonia. The wave of negation faltered and died. In the aftermath, a new, fragile silence descended. The quarantine was broken. The Ethelgard High Command was shattered, its leadership either catatonic or in disarray. The survivors, both Ethelgard and human, were left blinking in the ruins of their old certainties. Lyra severed her connection with Kaelin. the psychic backlash leaving them both drained and irrevocably changed. She was no longer a high strategos of a unified empire. She was the leader of a fractured, traumatized people, haunted by the ghosts of human emotion. Kalen was no longer a simple dissident. He had been inside the mind of his enemy and had emerged with a terrifying understanding of both their power and their fragility. He was returned to Earth, not by a capture beam, by a simple, humble transport, set down in the cold, windswept ruins of Chicago. There was no victory. There was only survival. The Ethelgard did not leave Earth. They could not. They were too broken. Their network too fragmented. The great floating citadels remained, but they were no longer symbols of dominion. They were refugee camps in the sky, filled with the people struggling to reconcile their logical nature with the chaotic, emotional virus they had contracted. On the ground, humanity began the slow, arduous process of rebuilding. The cognitive plague had left scars. Millions were left with fractured memories, a generation adrift in a sea of confusion. But humanity, as it always had, endured. Anya, using her newfound access to the shattered network, began to slowly restore the systems necessary for life, not as gifts from an overlord, but as tools salvaged by human ingenuity. There were no treaties signed, no grand speeches made. A new, unspoken accord settled over the planet. It was not peace. It was a truce, born of mutual exhaustion and a shared, terrifying glimpse into the abyss of total annihilation. Humans and Ethelgard began a tentative, wary interaction. Human artists were brought to the citadels, not to be studied, but to teach the Ethelgard the language of their newfound emotions. Ethelgard engineers descended to the surface, sharing their knowledge of technology not to control, but to help rebuild. It was a messy, difficult, and often painful integration. Old hatreds died hard. Fear was a constant companion, but for the first time, they were not ruler and subject. They were two broken species, trying to build a future from the wreckage of their war. Kalen never became a great leader. He returned to the ruins, to the taste of rust and the ghosts of the past. He became a storyteller, a keeper of the memory of what had been lost and what had been learned. He would sit by a fire in the skeletal remains of the old city, and he would tell the children, both human and the occasional, curious Ethelgard youth, the story of the war. He told them of the cage of perfect peace and the terrible, beautiful chaos of freedom. He told them of a curator who became a warlord and a rebel who became a bridge. He told them that their greatest strength was not in their perfection, but in their flaws, not in their logic, but in their illogical, stubborn, and magnificent hearts. The galaxy did not fall silent. It began to learn a new song, a dissonant but beautiful chord, played in the key of survival. The war was over. The long, difficult peace had just begun.